in Central Park, the cavernous Javits Convention Centre turned into an ICU. And I think something that really brought it home was the sight of the UN humanitarian stockpile, donating hundreds of thousands of face masks to Mayor Bill de Blasio. But I made these observations, not really to reflect on my experience here, but to highlight that I think seldom before has the UN and its policymakers been as affected in such a direct way and been in such close proximity to a crisis that they were charged with framing policy to respond to. And I think on the whole, UN agencies have adapted quickly and well to the pandemic. The World Food Programme being just one of many, and they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their works. The WHO has obviously received attention, and all would know the World Health Assembly member states agreed to an independent evaluation of the global COVID response. So I think COVID has demonstrated, like perhaps nothing else could, that there are some issues that can really only be handled by global collective action. Now, Michael, we're in the 75th year of the UN, so it's a natural time to reflect on what's worked, what needs reform and refurbishment. So I think it's the right thing to acknowledge the successes, but also to be clear-eyed. But to do this, I think it's really important to firstly understand the UN and the limits of what can be achieved. And I think the best analogy I have come across from one of my Nordic ambassadorial colleagues is to liken the UN and its organs to a cross between a parliament and the Vatican. The General Assembly of 193 member states and its 6 committees really does operate with the collegiality of a parliament. 50% plus 1 is required to do things, and 50% plus 1 is required to stop things. Ambassadors in this place operate more like senators in a chamber where no party has the numbers, rather than as bilateral ambassadors seeking the attention of a host government. Then alongside the General Assembly in the international enclave on the East River at Turtle Bay is the UN Secretariat. Now, it's not entirely unlike the Vatican City-State, with the Secretary-General cast in the role of a secular pope appointed by the conclave of ambassadorial cardinals in the Security Council. And to take the analogy to its logical absurdity, many of the UN agencies operate a bit like quasi-independent papal states, with their own mandates and their own structures. But just to take that analogy back a little bit, the UN agencies, when I say they operate to their own mandates, they are member state run, like the ITU, like the IPU. Now, Michael, yes, the system is a labyrinth, it's complex, it can be frustrating, but as in Parliament, in most UN fora, it's numbers that count. And I think if bilateral work is akin to legislating in the House of Representatives, where wins are more straightforward, multilateral work, it's like legislating in the Senate. Wins take longer, they're hard won through persuasion and coalition building, and sometimes they entail compromise. And just as in legislating, you need the House and the Senate. In prosecuting the national interest, you need both bilateral and multilateral engagement. I think often when people aren't happy with something that the UN does, the issue isn't so much the institution itself. It's actually, you've got to remember, it's a decision of member states. The UN, it's not a building, it's not the UN Secretariat. The UN is the member states. Now, none of this is to say that the UN system and its institutions don't need tending to and some reform across the UN mandates of peace and security and development and human rights. But when you're talking about the UN reform, things need to be practical and realistic. And a case in point, an example of practical reform that's been able to be achieved is the UN development system. There's been contestability between agencies, which has been introduced. There's better coordination at the country level. The UN Secretary General, just another quick example, something that matters in our region, in the Indo-Pacific, has agreed to the need for a new UN office in the North Pacific, something our Pacific Island neighbours are very keen on. In the peace and security field, reform has meant putting a premium on conflict prevention, also breaking down silos within the UN's human rights and development work. Got to be frank, these reforms are not always supported, they're contested, but with painstaking diplomacy, we do inch forward.
Maybe a few more seconds, if that's okay, 15 seconds, sure. If that's okay. Thank you.
Sure. The perennial issue, of course, is UN Security Council reform. Now, that could occupy a session on itself, Michael, so I'll leave it at that for now. But just to conclude, it's important to mention that well before COVID and the 75th anniversary, brought a renewed focus on UN bodies. The Prime Minister commissioned a stocktake of our multilateral engagement, and that essentially reaffirmed the importance of being involved in these institutions, because you can never pick which part of the UN system is going to matter in the future, as COVID has shown. You've got to be there, you've got to be involved, you've got to be shaping the rules and norms. Michael, thanks indeed, and look forward to a good discussion.
Thank you very much, Mitch. I remember one former Australian ambassador to the UN who didn't come from the diplomatic corps, making a comment when he's living in New York. He said, "It's finally come to this, Michael. I'm now living in public housing in New York City." So it's a claim that any ambassador can make to the UN. Teresa, it's now just after 8:15 in the morning in London. Welcome to the dialogue. Welcome to this session. I wonder if you would like to share some comments, observations about the topic, about the UN.
Yes, I'd be delighted. It's an honour to join such a distinguished panel. And whilst COVID has been sort of hugely disruptive and restricted so much of our lives, one thing the Zoom revolution has prompted is the benefit of bringing people together virtually for important discussions like this in a way perhaps never attempted on this scale before. So I'm pleased that this conference is actually going ahead, despite the fact that we can't all be in the same room or the same country together. And I have to say, when it comes to the UN, I've long been concerned about the UN's approach on Israel. And this obviously is a matter which Hillel and UN Watch have highlighted over many years, but also a number of the people that I represent in North London, in my constituency, Chipping Barnet, have regularly contacted me over the years about resolutions in the United Nations regarding Israel, which they view as one-sided. And it seems to me that one of the United Nations' greatest weaknesses is that it does single out Israel for criticism in a way which is disproportionate and unjustified, and simply isn't reflected in their attitude to other countries. It's depressing to see this long-standing problem continue with votes taking place as recently as last month. For example, on the 4th of November, in the UN Special Political and Decolonization Committee of the UN General Assembly backed a resolution criticizing Israel, which was actually co-sponsored by Bashar al-Assad. I think that was particularly shocking. To condemn Israel for its actions in relation to the Golan Heights is astonishing when one considers the appalling conduct of the Syrian regime just across the border in the territory that it controls. And since 2015, the UN General Assembly, I'm sure this audience will know, has adopted, I gather, at 96 condemnatory resolutions on Israel, compared to just 4 on Iran, which has a shocking human rights record, 5 on North Korea, 7 on Syria, 3 on Myanmar, and none at all on China, Libya, Pakistan, or Zimbabwe. In March 2017, the UK government delivered an unprecedented condemnation of the UN Human Rights Council's bias against Israel, announcing that it was putting the body on notice and would vote against every motion on the conflict unless the Human Rights Council ended its disproportionate and biased approach to Israel. As Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson repeated this condemnation in February 2018. And the frustrating thing, though, is that I'm afraid UK delegations in the various UN bodies do continue sometimes to vote for these resolutions or at least abstain on them. And I'm afraid I've had a long history of complaining about this and will continue to do so if it carries on. And I hugely regret the UK government vote in favour of the notorious resolution 2234 a year or 2 back. Like so many other UN resolutions, that actively makes a negotiated settlement harder by trying to predetermine issues such as the governance of the holy sites in Jerusalem. And as I'm sure we'll explore during this discussion, my fear is that the UN undermines its own effectiveness and credibility by taking a highly partisan approach. And I've seen this sort of especially in relation to the UN Human Rights Council. It's a body I've actually visited in Geneva to talk about human rights in Sri Lanka. And it has, I have to say, done very good work on seeking justice for the victims of crimes committed during the Sri Lankan Civil War. It really led the way. It got important resolutions adopted, and it persuaded the government of Sri Lanka to put its name to those resolutions. So it's frustrating that that kind of worthwhile and laudable work on one conflict is, I think the credibility of that is undermined by the HRC's unreasonable and dogmatic approach on the Middle East. Not least because that unreasonable and dogmatic approach has, for the moment, caused the US to pull out altogether from the Human Rights Council. And if the United Nations, I think, is ever going to be the universally trusted forum for global cooperation and dispute resolution that it aspires to be and that we would all want it to be, then it urgently needs a fresh approach on the dispute between Israel and the Palestinians. And I warmly welcome the most recent development in relation to that dispute, the Abraham Accords. They reflect changing attitudes across a number of countries in the Middle East. And I hope that this shift will see others follow the lead set by UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan. And while there's not much evidence of it so far, I hope that one day this thawing of relationships frozen for many years between the Arab world and Israel starts also to influence the UN, so it can begin to give Israel a much fairer hearing than has been the case over past decades. And I look forward to discussion with fellow panelists in the audience on these important matters. And there, Chairman, I'll hand back to you and look forward to questions later on.
Thank you very much, Teresa. And we'll now go to Hillel. And it's interesting, the UN in 1947 obviously played a big role in the formation of Israel. In 1975, we had the Zionism is racism, a great evil is loosed upon the world, as Daniel Patrick Moynihan put it, the United States ambassador to the UN, and some improvements that Teresa has just referred to. And yet last Wednesday, the UN Security Council voted on 5 resolutions, which Australia voted against. And Hillel, you strike me as a human rights lawyer mugged by reality, and you now head up UN Watch. Over to you. It's now 9:24 a.m. in the morning in Geneva. Over to you, Hillel. You're muted, Hillel.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm actually based in Geneva, but I'm currently speaking to you from the beautiful city of Tel Aviv. So, I can't claim it's that early. It's 10:25 a.m. But thank you for having me, and it's great to be on this call with distinguished individuals who I've had the pleasure to meet. And actually, 1 year ago, two of the people on the call, Ambassador Danon and the Ambassador of Australia, were with UN Watch when we honored Nikki Haley at the Plaza Hotel, one of the last events that we had before COVID. So it's great to be reunited again. 75 years ago, we saw a very important development in world affairs with the creation of the United Nations Charter, and we're marking the 75th anniversary this year of an indispensable international organization. The United Nations is regarded as the repository of international legitimacy, and as mentioned by a number of my colleagues on this panel, the United Nations has made important contributions in this regard. In many areas and across many UN bodies. The General Assembly, the World Parliament, which is currently meeting in its annual legislative session, has adopted in the past month and will confirm those resolutions next week. Important resolutions for human rights victims in North Korea, important resolution for human rights victims in Iran, which a long resolution that documents numerous gross and systematic violations against the rights of women, against the rights of the Baha'is and other minorities, and resolution for human rights victims in Syria, for example. So when the United Nations can rally like-minded countries and to act in concert to put a spotlight on some of the world's most egregious abuses and speak out for victims, it truly lives up to its founding purpose to uphold international peace and security, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. So, certainly it can do so at the General Assembly, it can also do so at the Human Rights Council and in other bodies when our democracies lead and when they can find the coalitions to do so. It's not always possible to find that coalition. But unfortunately, as Teresa mentioned, this same General Assembly, and others have mentioned, and the same General Assembly this month is currently adopting 17 resolutions that single out Israel, for example. But that's certainly not the only problem with the United Nations. It really goes far beyond Israel. And it is a problem that I would say two things. One is that sometimes our democracies fail to act and lead in a way that they should to speak out for victims. And other times we have an issue where dictatorships tend to dominate certain bodies. Certainly in New York, there's a committee that's of concern to me. Our organization, UN Watch, is a non-governmental organization, an NGO. And there's a committee that oversees NGOs, and it is dominated by countries like China, Nicaragua, Turkey is the vice president. And there's only a handful of democracies that can speak out and defend NGOs that seek credentials there. That's in New York. In Geneva, of course, we have the Human Rights Council, which includes such champions of human rights as Eritrea, as Bangladesh, and as Venezuela, which was elected last year. The Maduro regime, which has destroyed its own country. He's destroyed his own country. 5 million people have fled, and there's a humanitarian catastrophe there, and he's been unwilling to accept international aid. So that's the Maduro regime. And then in 3 weeks' time, these champions of human rights will be joined by China, Russia, and Cuba, which have just been elected to the Human Rights Council. So it's funny to mention these things, but it's quite serious, because if you want to get something done, and Teresa mentioned the case of Sri Lanka, that's a positive example of what was done in Sri Lanka, but it wasn't always the case. Back in May 2009, I was there in Geneva when right after Sri Lanka had killed 40,000 Tamils, when a special session was called by the good guys to put a spotlight on Sri Lanka, but the bad guys took over the session and they had the majority. And the outcome resolution of that special session back in May 2009 was a document praising Sri Lanka for promoting and protecting human rights after it had killed 40,000 Tamils. So when you get dictatorships that dominate these bodies, you'll get a situation where the Human Rights Council has never spoken out once for women in Saudi Arabia, for minorities, for Christians who are on death row for blasphemy in Pakistan. There's never been a resolution on Saudi Arabia, on Pakistan, Zimbabwe, Cuba, and the list goes on. So I would say these bodies can work if our democracies fight to make them work, and it's not always the case. I think, when it comes to the election of dictatorships, our democracies too often don't even speak out. We know that the UK, according to leaked documents, was in conversations with Saudi Arabia to elect each other onto the Human Rights Council. And David Cameron effectively admitted that on an interview, that they had reasons for it, but that they voted for Saudi Arabia to be on the Human Rights Council. So I think that's quite unfortunate. And we've certainly tried to fight the election of these dictatorships to the council.
And Hillel, if you could summarize now, and then we'll go to Ambassador Danon. But over to you, another 15 seconds, if that's okay.
Thank you. Yes, I think that the UN bodies are what we make of them, and democracies need to act in concert to ensure that these bodies do uphold democracy and don't protect dictatorships.
Thank you. Ambassador Danon, welcome back to the dialogue. I'm sure you have a range of opinions that you can share with us on this very interesting topic. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody from Israel. Thank you, Albert, for your leadership. Mitch, it's 3 a.m. and you look very, very sharp, so that's amazing. I hope to see you in person in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem soon, and to see all of you in the forum in Jerusalem next year. So I have to tell you that, after serving 5 long years at the UN, I learned a lot about this organization. And in Israel in general, when you will ask the average Israeli, he will tell you, why do we need the UN? Why to bother? Maybe we should, finish with that, pull out from this organization. And it's a waste of time, waste of effort, waste of energy. This is not my opinion. I think the UN is an important organization. The very fact that you have leaders meeting in one building and we talk, it's meaningful. And Theresa mentioned the Abraham Accord. So I can tell you that parts of the thing that we see today started in the corridors of the UN. So it was done quietly, behind closed doors. And we see the outcomes today in the White House and in Dubai. As we speak, you have 14 flights from Tel Aviv to Dubai. I don't know for how long the Emirates will bear with so many Israelis in the streets of Dubai, but it is amazing, because when I visited Dubai 3 years ago in my UN capacity, it had to be coordinated, and it was very complicated to organize everything. And today you have tens of thousands of Israelis traveling to the UAE and Bahrain. So I think we can change the UN from the inside. It's not easy, and I proved it when I decided to run for positions in the UN. And I want to give you one example. When I decided to run for the position of the chairman of the legal committee, the 6th committee, my colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were against it. They told me, Danny, we cannot win in this body. It's a lost case. And I said, so what? So we will lose, but let's try. And I gathered the support of many of our friends, and it was secret ballots. And we received the support of 109 member states who supported me. Only 44 voted against me. And I became the first Israeli ever to chair a UN permanent committee, the 6th committee, the legal committee. And it was the proudest moment when I walked into the chamber of the 6th committee and I chaired for a year the committee. And it proved that we can get things done even in a hostile place like the UN. But in order to continue, I think we change the actual bureaucracy of the UN. I will be very specific about it. One of the things that I was shocked to see at the UN, that every year we vote at the UN on the exact same resolutions. And for me, as somebody who came from the parliament and the government, it was ridiculous. But once you pass a resolution, you move on. But when you see what happened a few weeks ago in the General Assembly, they voted on the resolutions against Israel. And you know what? I told it to my colleagues. I told them, if you want to attack Israel, at least be relevant. Change the language of the resolution, bring new ideas, but they don't do it. So every year, and it's not only about Israel, it's about the entire global issues, they bring the same language and they vote on the same resolutions. And look what happened this year. Instead of having a discussion about the Abraham Accords, you can support it, you can be against it, you can raise the Palestinian issue, everything is legitimate. But let's have a relevant discussion. They go back and they discuss the previous resolution that passed 20 years ago, same language, it's boring, it's irrelevant. And I think if the UN wants to be effective, we have to change that mechanism and decide that once we vote on a resolution, we move on. And every year we present new resolutions, new ideas, and I think it will be helpful for all. And it will also change the issue of anti-Israel agenda at the UN. Because today, instead of dealing with other issues, with Iran, with North Korea, they don't have time for that. They have so much energy that they have to put into those ridiculous anti-Israel resolutions, so there is no room for other ideas. I think, you know, the forum is very important in this issue, because when I was at the UN, I always spoke about the moral majority. We don't have the numbers, but we have the moral majority. And if you take strong democracies who give most of the funding to the UN, they can make the change. They should demand to see the changes. And Mitch mentioned the UN Security Council reform. And I think every agency of the UN, when you look at it, it should be reformed. Whether it's UNRWA, World Health Organization. Look what happened in the last 6 months. It was a disaster. You know, this organization, they received hundreds of millions of dollars to prepare the world for a crisis. And look what they did in the last few months. So I think that the responsibility is on the leaders of the strong democracies, for sure the UK, Australia, US, Israel, Germany, and you name, you know, all of them. They should sit together and say, we will continue to support the UN, we will continue with the funding, but we demand A, B, and C. I think it will help the UN, it will help the developing countries, and definitely it will help Israel, because Israel will move to a different stage, that instead of defend our positions 24/7, we will be able to share our technology, to share our ideas, and to support developing countries. So I'm optimistic about it. It's a long process, but it requires strong leaders that will lead the moral majority at the UN.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I know that Alan Howe has been getting some questions, and those on the panel, please let Alan know your question. Before I go to him, Mitch, you talked about the need for reform and the Australian government approach, and you're determined to try and do a few things to shake up the organisation. Ambassador Danon has just talked about optimism in the context of the moral majority and never giving up. Teresa and Hillel have highlighted a number of the deficiencies of the organisation, the repeated resolution, the disappointment we all feel about what comes out of UN agencies. I wonder, Mitch, do you have a timeline? What do you think is realistic in terms of reforms that you will be seeking to have an impact on through the Australian government? That's my first question. Members of the panel might want to then comment, and then we'll throw it open to Alan Howe to let us know the questions that have been coming in from participants. But Mitch, what are your comments on that question?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I mentioned briefly in my remarks that in October last year, the Prime Minister commissioned a stocktake of Australia's multilateral engagement, its efficacy. The Foreign Minister in June spoke at the ANU and shared the results of the audit, and her conclusions, the audit's conclusions, were that multilateral bodies are under pressure. That's something we know. That's something that we've canvassed. That the performance at time has struggled. But one of the key points that she made, and this goes to any forum, any international body where you want to seek reform, or where you want to seek an outcome, her concluding remark, and I think there's a lot in this, was when it comes to multilateralism, nothing just happens. when you want to affect change in an organisation, or if you just want to pass a resolution, as Danny was talking about before, you need to build coalitions, issue by issue, to affect change. And that's why I've spent some time drawing the analogy between the Senate and the General Assembly. No one has the numbers in their own right. You need to build coalitions. Danny spoke to something which is incredibly important, and that is just the basic working methods of the General Assembly of the United Nations. There's a lot that could be done to make them more efficient. A lot of time is spent going over the same ground again and again, and that is one of the most practical things that you could do to affect reform. Just and I'll finish on this point, Michael. The UN Security Council, I think, is often the forum through which people determine if they think the UN is effective or not. And Australia has always had the view, and there's an annual process which looks at the Security Council reform, but we have always had the view that the Security Council should better reflect the world as it is today, that there should be greater representation for Asia, Africa, Latin America. We've always said that there should be greater coordination between the Security Council and the General Assembly, and also that there should be better standards for the use of the veto. So these are things that Australia has sought for some time and will continue to. I can't put a time frame on it, but we constantly raise these issues in the forums.
Thank you very much, Mitch. And a lot of those comments go to what, Danny, you mentioned about leadership and the need to have leadership to affect change. I wonder if the other members of the panel would like to comment on 2 or 3 things that you believe are achievable, maybe not with a timeline, but perhaps if you have one, that'd be great. Hillel, why don't I ask you first if you could unmute yourself, if there's 2 or 3 things that you think are achievable with the reform of the UN, and then I'll ask Teresa and Danny to comment as well.
I'll mention one thing that's come up is the issue of Israel. I think here it's notable this week that there were, last week actually, there were several significant voting changes. There are 2 annual resolutions of the 17 or so that will be adopted this year singling out Israel. There are 2 that are significant in that they renew entities whose very raison d'etre, whose very purpose is to propagandize against Israel. One is the Committee on Inalienable Palestinian Rights, and then a 15 staff member division on Palestinian rights, which organizes propaganda events against Israel year-round and worldwide. And the votes on those committees and divisions just had significant vote changes. Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, Slovenia, Switzerland changed their votes and voted no on one or both of those resolutions, joining a larger group, including Australia and others that voted no. I regret that the UK continued to abstain, even though a country like Switzerland, which is rarely more balanced on the issue of Israel than the UK would. I regret that the UK and France abstained, whereas other countries like Canada, Australia, Colombia, and others voted no. So I think that's one example where votes can change. And I think countries like the Czech Republic were quite out in the forefront on that. So votes can change and they should on things like that. Something else I think that's important is to speak the truth. When the Human Rights Council adopts resolutions that shield regimes like Syria, China, and Cuba. For example, across European countries, they're adopting something called the Magnitsky Act, which enables parliaments, I think Australia has one, if I'm not mistaken. It enables parliaments to sanction gross human rights abusers worldwide, and in the EU Magnitsky Act was just adopted yesterday. It's quite significant to target, for example, Putin's oligarchs who are behind the poisoning of dissidents. And then you have a UN mechanism at the Human Rights Council, for example, but it also appears at the General Assembly, that is against sanctions against dictators. It's called the Special Rapporteur Against Unilateral Coercive Measures, which is a shameless a mechanism to shield the worst dictatorships, like Syria, like Russia, from any scrutiny or sanction. And these things happen. And yet, when, for example, the FCO published their, the Foreign Office in the UK, when they published their summary of a session, they will say that it was a great session and the session played an essential role in holding to account those who violate human rights and addressing pressing human rights issues. But they don't say that the non-aligned movement passed this resolution, which is used by regimes like Iran, Syria, Russia, and Venezuela as a tool to attack the West. So I think we need to have truth-telling if we're going to have change.
Thank you. And Teresa, what are your comments if you could unmute yourself?
I would like to see reform in the way the UN delivers its aid programs. I think the sort of the bureaucracy and the lack of accountability is worrying. There are huge sums being spent in some of the, the most troubled areas of the world. And I think if the UN is going to have the credibility we need it to have for it to be effective, it needs to ensure that the resources it has are devoted to the right purposes and that we reduce. I mean, in any program, there's potential for abuse. You can't keep track of every single penny, but I think a great deal more could be done to ensure that the money vested in the UN is appropriately spent for worthwhile purposes. And I suppose I can't in this context help but mention the UNHCR, UNRWA, if I can call it that, the aid agency which supports the Palestinians. Of course, I think it is important for the international community to provide assistance to institutions in relation to the Palestinians, but I do have a real concern that the approach taken by UNRWA really perpetuates division in relation to Israel and the Palestinians because of its definition of refugee, which is different from the UN's approach, different from approaches by organizations around the world, in that refugee status is deemed to pass down through the generations, leading to a massive increase in the number of people who are classified as refugees as compared to those who actually did lose their homes back in the 1940s. So I would like to see greater accountability for UN aid programs, particularly UNRWA.
Thank you very much, Teresa. And Danny, I'm sure you've got an opinion on the question. 2 or 3 things that could be achievable.
So first, I think we should not expect a reform with the Security Council, unfortunately. I tried so many times to bring a language to the Security Council to condemn Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, and they couldn't do it because always Russia and China veto the language. And I think when you read the charter of the UN, in order to make any reform in the Security Council, you need the support of the Security Council. So it will be very hard to convince Russia and China to support any major reform in the UN Security Council. But what we can do is to use the funds. And I think many countries that support the UN, they should start, you have the annual commitment that you cannot touch, but most of the democracies, they donate so much more money above and beyond their commitment to the UN agencies. And they should start there and say, okay, we will continue to support those important causes, but we will decide how to do it. We will decide how it's working. In Israel, there was a debate, maybe in the future we should build a UN for democracies. I think it's far-reaching. I don't think we should build a new institution, but I think we should use the strength of our economies, of the funding that we contribute to the UN. I'm not talking about Israel because we are a small country, but mainly the strong democracies, and start to change things in the UN and the leadership of those organizations, I think that is feasible, and it will be a good sign for the future.
Thank you very much. We've had a number of questions have come in. Alan Howe is coordinating the questions. Over to you, Alan.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. First off, there's a few people have posed similar questions to Teresa Villiers, asking that with the normalised relations with the UAE and Bahrain, how that might change attitudes within the UN and how quickly, and what would it mean for that process were Saudi Arabia to do the same?
For the moment, I mean, I understand that within the UN, it isn't changing attitudes. I mean, others on the panel may be more up to date, but even the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan are apparently still voting for anti-Israel resolutions. But I think it is quite a sort of fundamental shift. And therefore, I would really hope that we do over time see that start to change attitudes within the UN. And I think the questioners are right. If we saw Saudi Arabia take similar steps to those three countries, then that would be hugely significant. And one would hope that absolutely that would start to have an impact on the debate in the UN. But as I think everyone's pointed out, Mitch included in particular, to get things done in the UN requires very sort of painstaking kind of coalition building because of the way the numbers operate. So I think even if we were to have that Saudi Arabia breakthrough, I'm afraid it wouldn't lead to any overnight change in the United Nations, but I hope it might open the way for that over the longer term.
I'm sure members of the panel would like to make some comment. Could I make a suggestion? We save them for the 1 minute at the end, each of you to make a comment at the end, because I know there are some other questions. So why don't we exhaust them first, and then we'll go to the panel for some final comments. Alan.
Hillel, Michael Danby from Australia has a question for you. If Helen Clark heads up the UN investigation into the origins of COVID-19, has China won? If so, why and how extensive is China's influence in the UN?
Well, I thank Michael for that question, and we miss Michael at the Human Rights Council. He came a few years ago to be with us and to speak about victims in Syria. And we invite, if there are other parliamentarians who want to visit Geneva and take the floor, UN Watch is happy to give it to them. Thank you, Michael, for that question about the WHO. As mentioned before, the World Health Organization, in response to Australia and other countries who requested it, has created an international panel to examine the global response to the pandemic, and that includes the WHO's response to the pandemic, as well as those of particular countries. Which would include, of course, China, which played a significant role in the origins of the COVID-19 virus. And we and others have expressed concerns that Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, was made the co-chair of this inquiry and seems to be playing a leading role for really two reasons. This is an important inquiry. The world needs to trust it. It needs to be credible. And the fact that Helen Clark, for the past year alone, has been an advocate for the WHO's response. She's repeatedly on her Twitter account, one can see it, has been saying, you know, the WHO has been great and they've been terrific in their response. And she was, you know, saying these things while tagging Dr. Tedros, the chief of the WHO. So she was really a unequivocal partisan celebrating the WHO's actions. And now she's meant to investigate. You can't be an advocate for a party and be a judge at the same time. That's number one. Secondly, clearly China is a major issue in examining the coronavirus. And Helen Clark has a record going back about 4 decades of being a very strong promoter of China. In 1986, going back to then, she chaired a panel in the New Zealand Parliament that called for boosting ties with China. She's the one who brought in the free trade agreement with China. And when she came in 2001 to China, she was called an old and good friend. So she's someone who's considered a very old and good friend of China. And it's not clear that a reasonable person would think that she's impartial on that issue. I'm not saying that she's being, influenced by China, but, when she ran to be Secretary General, which she didn't get, the headlines were China keen on Helen Clark's bid. So I think that's inappropriate. And we've expressed that, and her response was ad hominem and not substantial at all. So we regret that. And I think, certainly we reiterate our call, as others have called, that she should step down if we're going to have an inquiry that the world will treat as serious and credible.
Thank you very much, Alan.
We'll throw this one to Mitch Fifield. Make sure he's still on his toes at 3:30. Mitch, Lord Pickles has sent us a question from the UK. The UNRWA uses its funds not to bring accord, but to fuel resentment. Should it be wound up?
Look, Alan, we participate positively. We contribute in UN forums where we have the opportunity to do so. Can I just say, across the board, when it comes to the UN and its forums, that we oppose anti-Israel bias, we oppose unbalanced language, we oppose disproportionate attention to any one country, and that's reflected in our negotiations on resolutions, and that's reflected in our votes.
Could I mention to everyone that we end the Zoom call within an hour? We've only booked an hour, so I might now ask each of the panelists just to respond with a 1 minute, no more please, less is even greater, even better. I might mention that Gerald Steinberg asked a question about the UN Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People as being a driving of the anti-Israel agenda, and could that be ended? That was a question that we may not have the time to answer, but could I ask the panel members, maybe in reverse order to how we began, just to give no more than a minute in any comment that you would like to make. So I'll ask Ambassador Danon to begin.
Thank you. So I think we should look at what's happening today with COVID-19 as an opportunity to change the narrative at the UN, because we are starting to think about post-COVID world, and we will see that we are coming back to life, flying, dealing with multilateral issues. And I think it brings an opportunity to discuss the important issues that we need to promote at the UN. And Israel can play a major role in terms of sharing our technology. I like to use the term Diplod technology, applying it very technology to support our diplomacy. And I think, we can offer a lot in terms of security, health, agri-tech, and those issues. That's what people care about. In the last 5 years, I had the honor to bring to Israel more than 100 UN ambassadors. Mitch, I'm sorry we couldn't organize the trip before I left, but we are waiting for you here. And on those trips, we speak a lot about security.
And
Hamas,
thank you, Danny. Yeah, I'm thinking of no more than a minute, so.
Okay, I will conclude. Most of the ambassadors, they care about food and health for their people. That should be the discussion at the UN and not the anti-Israel agenda.
Thank you. Hillel, if you could unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. On its 75th anniversary, it's time for the United Nations to live up to its principles, to stop electing the world's worst dictatorships to human rights bodies, and to stop singling out and demonizing the world's only Jewish state with, most of its time. We've created a new database called, it's available at unwatch.org/database, unwatch.org/database, and that lists which dictatorships are on the Human Rights Council at any given point, which abusers of women's rights are sitting on the UN Women Agency, and other such human rights bodies, as well as a list of all the anti-Israel resolutions, as well as resolutions on every other country, to give key information, key facts, key statistics, the texts, as well as an opportunity for people to sign a petition and take action. So I think it's vital if we want change for people to have the facts and to be able to take action. And that's what we hope our new database will do and make the UN live up to its founding purpose.
Thank you. Teresa.
After all these months of a pandemic having such a devastating impact on so many people's lives, I think it has to be a priority for the UN to radically shake up all its initiatives on public health so that the international community is better prepared next time this happens. It's not just COVID. We face huge risks potentially from antimicrobial resistance or from other diseases in the future. And I think the pandemic has demonstrated that there is a great deal more that we need by way of international cooperation in order to address these concerns for the future. And I think that the work that's underway on climate change, there has been, I think, some good work done in the UN on that.
Thank you.
But the urgency of tackling this, they need to do more.
Thank you, Teresa. Mitch.
Thanks, Michael. I mean, I guess in summary, our multilateral stock taker referred to before, we think that we've got to work to ensure global institutions are fit for purpose and that they're accountable to member states. In terms of how we ensure this, I think it's important to recognise that the UN is the only place in the world where every country is represented. And this is often the only place where countries talk to each other. And just finally, Michael, technology has enabled a lot of business to be transacted during COVID, but in diplomacy, people matter. We post people overseas because people can do the things that only people can do, and that is develop relationships, and that's critical.
Thank you very much. Could I thank the panel? Can I particularly thank Albert Dedon for putting it all together? Mitch in particular getting up at 3 a.m. in the morning to join us. And hopefully we'll see you all next year in Jerusalem.